Okay, we are pretty much right on time. Hello and welcome to the afternoon panels of the second day of the fourth International Conference, Why Still Education? Experiences of Education. My name is Rodoljub Jovanović. I'm a research fellow here at the Institute of Philosophy and Social Theory, University of Belgrade, and it is my pleasure to welcome you at our today's session named Empowering Parents, Moral, Decolonial and Abolitionist Education, where we have two presenters, which means that we're going to have some more time for discussion. So the first is Florian Rieger from the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, Departments of Arts, Media and Philosophy, University of Basel, with his presentation, Moral Education and Reactive Attitudes. Before I give the word to Florian, I'm just going to say that we are going to keep to the format of presentation of 20 minutes and then the discussion of around 10 minutes Q&A, and then the second presentation the same. So if you have questions for Florian, think about them and ask them after his presentation. So your 20 minutes start now.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Just before I start, I want to note, I've changed my title a bit, but I will explain what that's about in what follows. And what I want to say in advance, when I'm going to talk about education and what follows, I always mean the narrow field of moral education. So it's just a shorthand, just so you know. And then I will start right away. And I would like to begin my presentation with the following passage from Peter Strawson's essay, Freedom and Resentment, which I'm not going to read. You can take a look at it while I make some brief comments on it. The two types of attitudes Strawson refers to here in this passage are what he also calls reactive and objective attitudes. The paradigm cases of reactive attitudes are emotions like anger or resentment, which we feel in response to the harms or insults that we might suffer from other people. However, when dealing with individuals who are, for instance, in the state of a psychological crisis, or who are like children still immature and hence require a different treatment, we can withdraw from this perspective of a personal involvement that is characteristic of these reactive attitudes. In these cases, we adopt most of the times quite naturally and unthinkingly a less personal and objective attitude, which might nevertheless be shaped by certain emotions, but not by the reactive emotions with which we confront other mature agents. Now, Strawson's thesis in this passage is that the upbringing of young children requires a compromise between these two types of attitudes. In my presentation, I want to explore further this idea of a compromise of attitudes. And to do so, I want especially to question what Strawson seems to take for granted at the end of this passage, namely that punishing children is actually compatible with the idea of education or upbringing. As a first step, I will present a rough sketch of an argument that casts doubts on this compatibility. Following that, I will consider an attempt by Anselm Müller to defend the compatibility of punishment and education. Central to this attempt is what Müller calls an educational punishment, bildende Strafe in German, which this conception is in some ways related to Strawson's idea of a compromise of attitudes. In the third and the last part of my presentation, I will examine one aspect of this conception of an educational punishment more closely, and I will suggest very briefly at the end why punishment should still be replaced by other educational methods. So, can punishment be an acceptable means to raise children? This seems questionable from the start. For according to an intuitive definition, punishment is the intentional infliction of harm or the deprivation of some good due to a voluntary or intentional failure to meet a legitimate expectation or demand. Of course, this does not yet say anything about what concrete shape we may or may not wish punishment to take within the context of education. I will leave this issue for discussion. I just want to note here that, in my view, the use of physical violence should, in any case, be excluded from child rearing. What matters is how this notion of punishment can generally be reconciled with the goal of moral education or upbringing. Since education, moral education is or should primarily be concerned with the child's well-being, how can this be aligned with the infliction of harm or the deprivation of some good? Even at first glance, punishment and education seem to be incompatible. But this incompatibility can be further traced to a specific element in the concept of punishment. As mentioned, any punishment presupposes the voluntariness or intentionality of the behavior to be punished. But are children capable of this? For very often they are simply unaware that something is expected or demanded of them. So how can they be held accountable for a voluntary or intentional failure to meet these expectations or demands? It seems obvious that this is not possible. After all, we consider children to be immature precisely because they have yet to acquire the ability to be held responsible for possible offenses. And for this reason, punishment and education are incompatible, according to this argument. For if we actually punish our children for some putative misbehavior, we either treat them as already mature, responsible agents, which would render any educational effort redundant, insofar as education, especially moral education, is meant to help the children acquire this capacity for responsibility in the first place. Or, on the other hand, the act of punishment is unjustified or inappropriate because the punished children lack this very ability to be held responsible for their actions and to be punished accordingly. If we follow this argument, then the attempt to reconcile education and punishment seems to lead to a contradiction. Following Anselm Müller, we can thus speak of a paradox of pedagogical punishment. However, Müller also sketches a way to resolve this paradox. And he does so by introducing the concept of an educational punishment that I've mentioned before. And this is how he initially characterizes this conception. Educational punishment, bildende Strafe in German, is an improper punishment, which occupies, so to speak, a middle position on the continuum of possibilities between pre-rational conditioning and genuine punishment. It differs from the latter in that it does not presuppose the fully developed voluntariness of the behavior being punished. Educational punishment, therefore, is a punishment in roughly the same way that an aspiring teacher is a teacher. Both designations contain anticipations of final stages or endpoints of a development. So the key aspect of this concept of an educational punishment is obviously this anticipation of an endpoint of the development that education is meant to bring about. An anticipatory advance, so to speak, that's, which in turn drives this very development. This aligns with the idea of a proleptic engagement, which Agnes Kellert introduces in her monograph Aspiration, in order to account for any transformative development or change quite generally. In the following, I will therefore adopt her terminology and speak as well of a prolepsis or a proleptic engagement that characterizes the process of education, especially moral education. And I believe that this idea of a prolepsis or a proleptic engagement is also present in the passage from Strawson that I've mentioned at the beginning. To illustrate this, it will help to take a closer look at how Müller further explains his notion of an educational punishment. Its workings could best be understood, so Müller claims, in analogy to early language acquisition. Children learn and acquire their linguistic abilities by first imitating sounds, and then by testing the use of words or phrases in various contexts of use. They thus gradually discover what reactions this use of words triggers in experienced speakers. And according to Müller, a proleptic education towards responsibility works in similar ways. Children learn, I quote, the meaning of right and wrong, of responsibility and desert by, among other things, experiencing and testing for themselves the reactions their behavior elicits in their environment. The more children encounter resistance by evoking negative reactions of disapproval, rebuke, or punishment from their parents, the more likely they will learn, so Müller claims, to regulate themselves. However, it is important to conceive of these educational reactions from the parents in terms of this proleptic engagement. Müller is quite explicit about this feature, and he invokes once again the analogy of language acquisition to illustrate this point. For the purpose of language acquisition, parents speak or should speak to their children as if they already understood the meaning of the respective sentences. In a similar manner, parents should treat their children in moral education as if they already understood the meaning of their behavior, including its moral implications. But this clearly requires an objective attitude on the part of the parents. For the characteristic mark of such an attitude is, according to Strawson, that within it one cannot seriously quarrel or reason with the other person with whom one is engaged, though one can at least pretend to quarrel with them, or to reason with them. We could also say an objective attitude allows for a detached perspective on the interpersonal interaction, enabling one to engage with the other in such an as-if mode. On the part of the children, however, this mode of pretense will result in an exposure to the normal reactions of other people, that is, their approval or disapproval of certain actions. And this, in turn, will familiarize the children with the expectations and demands that characterize our interpersonal interactions quite generally. After all, the proneness to certain reactive attitudes is, according to Strawson, the expression of such demands and expectations. A proleptic education in this as-if mode is therefore also a gradual initiation into the system of norms, which is one central feature of our moral practice and of our practice of holding one another accountable. Hence, it is, in the words of Müller, the gradual transition from a stage of complete incapacity of responsibility to the stage of responsibility, where punishment can actually be deserved. So far, I believe a proponent of the incompatibility of punishment and education could perhaps follow Müller's argument and concede that negative, disapproving reactions to the child's behavior, i.e. certain reactive attitudes, admonishments, rebukes or scoldings, all of which Müller also calls tame forms of negative reaction, might indeed be compatible with education, moral education. But why should this comprise the practice of punishment as well? Is this then even necessary? Müller believes that it is, and one reason that he adduces in favor of this necessity is the following. Often the tame forms of negative reaction come too late. Then retrospective rejection of the behavior is necessary. However, this must not only work against repetition. As a reaction to past misbehavior, an educational punishment also contains a message that we might articulate as follows. You may be now preoccupied with other things, but you are now also someone who has betrayed their friend. You are now responsible for that. And our rejection of your behavior has not passed just because the behavior is in the past. It affects you now. Educational punishment tends to bring with it a preliminary form of the experience of guilt. Now, let me first ask how the child might initially react to such a punishment. I believe that it is not unlikely that the child's initial reaction will itself be just a negative attitude. The child will at first be angry at the parents or feel resentment towards them because they don't understand a thing or are just unfair. At this point, there is then no sign of guilt or the experience of guilt. That is why I would now like to ask, what is required for an educational punishment to lead to such an experience of guilt or a preliminary form of it, as Müller seems to have in mind here? To answer this question, we should, I believe, take a closer look at the conceptual framework in which guilt and punishment are, among other things, embedded. Following thoughts by Herbert Morris, I want to present a rough sketch of this framework. Morris first points out the connection between the concept of guilt and the concept of wrongdoing. Guilt only exists where there are and can be acts of wrongdoing. The latter presupposes a shared communal life in which we demand or expect certain behaviors from each other, particularly that others won't harm what is important to us and what we value. Whoever harms or insults others in this sense does wrong, but he or she will thereby also harm him or herself, because being integrated into a communal life with others is itself something of value to each individual. In the case of harm, however, this union with others will be interrupted, which will then ultimately reflect on the person who harms. Hence, in doing wrong, the wrongdoer in a sense separates him or herself from this union with others. And this is precisely what, according to Morris, constitutes guilt, which is most of the times accompanied by feelings of guilt that can make this state of being guilty a rather unpleasant or painful condition. For it is, after all, a state of being cut off from what is, among other things, dear to oneself. I will stop rather abruptly here. There's undoubtedly much more to say about these conceptual connections. However, I hope that my rough sketch will be sufficient to return now to the question of how Müller's educational punishment might lead to an experience of guilt. What should have become clear is that an educational punishment can only, at least in principle, lead to an experience of guilt if there is already an original union with others. Otherwise, neither the concept of guilt as a separation from this union nor the concept of punishment will apply. But for guilt to reveal itself to the child must also have an awareness of this union with others and its value. And in the early stages of education, moral education, this awareness is surely located on a sub-rational precognitive level. It is found in the form of the love that children receive from their parents and which gives them a sense of wholeness and completeness. However, when parents then react to their children's behavior with rejection and disapproval, this will naturally convey a sense of separation, which at least foreshadows guilt. Punishment as the strongest form of such a rejection or disapproval further emphasizes the significance of the boundary drawn by the parents' reactions. As an instance of a proleptic engagement, an educational punishment can therefore indeed bring about an experience of guilt or a preliminary form of it. The child will learn in this way, especially through their own experiences, the meaning of right and wrong, of guilt and wrongdoing, etc. And this will move. It will thus move step by step towards the stage of full responsibility. So, is the idea of punishment and compatible with moral education after all? Maybe, maybe not. We can thus discuss this question in a minute, but before we do that, I would like at least to briefly indicate how we can nevertheless exclude or at least marginalize punishment from the process of education, even if we are willing to concede with Müller their compatibility. And to do so, I would like to highlight another element in the conceptual framework that I've just outlined, namely the concept of shame. Shame differs from guilt insofar as shame does not concern any separation or the pursuit of restoring a union with others. Shame, according to Morris, targets an ideal identity that one values and strives to achieve. In shame, therefore, the individual is primarily dealing with themselves, who they are and who they want to be. No act of forgiveness from harmed individuals and certainly no punishment can thus remove shame once it is felt. But punishment and the guilt associated with it can very well evoke shame, namely when approval of the expectations or demands for whose non-fulfillment one is being punished is part of the ideal identity one strives to approach. Now, please note that the concept of shame is here not introduced to advocate shaming as an educational technique. What makes this dimension of shame important, in my view, is that without shame, it ultimately remains incomprehensible how an educational punishment can lead to an experience of guilt, as Müller is conceiving it. And this can be illustrated well with his example. According to Müller, an educational punishment contains as a message the rejection of the punished behavior. But this message also addresses the punished child on a level of their personal identity. To paraphrase Müller, you are someone who still has to answer for a past misdeed, or the rejection of this behavior concerns you. Hence, for the child to experience this rejection as a separation from an original union with others, and thus to lead to an experience of guilt, I believe the child must also perceive this rejection that is expressed by the punishment as some kind of flaw. If the child does not want to be someone who experiences rejection, then the actual rejection by their parents will activate the structure of shame and make the child, at least in principle, receptive for the experience of guilt. Shame, therefore, seems equally indispensable for moral education, since without shame, as Bernard Williams once pointed out, we cannot even start to understand our guilt. Müller, in his paper, neglects this moment of shame in his reflections entirely. And I believe that this can and should be criticized, because this neglect also leads him to disregard a dimension of education, especially moral education, that is addressed by the concept of shame and its reference to an ideal personal identity, namely the development of personality and the formation of character. But in this regard, the concept of punishment might lose its significance, because which ideal of identity the children strive to achieve can hardly be influenced by punishing them. Far more appropriate for this purpose would be for the parents to present themselves to the children as role models. That is to meet them with patience and understanding, to praise and encourage them once in a while, and rather than merely to admonish, to scold, or to criticize them. Punishment is then unnecessary, for to learn from such role models, children need only an ability that they already possess from birth, namely the ability for imitation, which according to Aristotle especially distinguishes our species. Maybe we may thus want to endorse what the Bavarian comedian Karl Valentin once reportedly said: children do not need no education, no reprimands, scoldings, no punishments, because they always already imitate everything we adults do anyway. In the spirit, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, and thank you for this interesting presentation. We would open the floor now for questions. Yes.
I don't know, before we started, I had another slide with references, but, no. Yeah, so you can see.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. I don't quite, I have to say, understand the relationship between shame and guilt. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if you could maybe just clarify that. It's very, very interesting.
Yeah.
I guess my big picture question I was thinking about throughout your talk is that many of the relationships that you introduce of power between the child and the authority figure, whether it's a parent or an educator, and this relationship of discipline through punishment, seems to me to be based on a paradigm of practical reason. Mm-hmm. So you introduce the idea of proleptic. You need that idea of prolepsis because you're still, it's a cause and consequence kind of relationship. It's based on causality. The child is punished because, right? Mm-hmm. And I wondered whether, when I think about shame, I don't think about it in relation to causality or to practical reason, but rather to irrational drives. And I also think of children not as necessarily becoming responsible on the route towards responsibility, but often just very irrational creatures who experience or who see the world primarily through emotions, and do you see what I'm trying to get at? There's this, I'm just trying to figure out if we can actually understand a lot of these ideas that you are raising on the basis of practical reason, or whether we might abandon that and try and think about a more integrative model that also confronts that irrationality plays a big role in guilt and shame and behavior that causes punishment. In punishment itself, many people who punish don't do it because they have an idea, like you had said that you would completely exclude corporal punishment from your model, but many people who punish do it out of for irrational reasons. So I'm sorry if that was a bit long-winded.
For irrational reasons.
I think so.
Oh, okay.
I mean, a lot of power and authority it's not always rational, right?
Yeah. Well, thank you for the question. Basically, that's a very abbreviated version of my paper. So if I had more time, I would have said more about this relation between guilt and shame, because it really is interesting. I don't believe that it's completely irrational, shame and guilt. I don't have an argument for that right now, but I'm not sure if that's complete irrational, because that's how we grow up. That you cannot make guilt disappear, and without if there's guilt, there's also shame, I believe, because without shame you cannot understand guilt. How anybody would any time feel guilt. That's basically, I'm relying on Bernard Williams, and also I think Gabriel Taylor makes a point like this. So shame and guilt are different, but shame is the more basic notion. So without shame, you cannot understand guilt. But I have to figure out how to put this in words in the next month, I guess. So I there is a lot of practical reason in this paper because I'm drawing on Müller, and he speaks of responsibility. So I'm not sure if that's the right approach. I just pick up on his argument because it is a powerful argument, I guess. But the argument against the compatibility of punishment and education, it's also from him, this paradox of pedagogical punishment. And he has a way to resolve this paradox, but I'm not sure if anybody, there are some people who defend this version of an incompatibility of punishment and education. And so I'm kind of torn between this perspective of leaving out punishment from education or moral education, and then his argument for the necessity. He speaks of a necessity of punishment. So I'm not sure. What I try to do is at the end to show that if he insists on punishment, then he needs that dimension of shame. And if this is in place, we might think about whether punishment is really a good educational method, because then you have the power and these issues, then there is no rationality, but mainly forcing children to under the will of the parents, something like this. And but if we have this dimension of shame, there comes a different perspective on the educational process. That's what I was thinking or heading towards, but I'm not sure if I was successful. There are some questions.
So I wanted to echo the thanks for this really stimulating presentation. I was thinking about this, and part of this is German versus English, but educational as in seeing and what effectively parents are doing,
yep.
And school sort of in local parentis versus in educational settings. And I think about a lot of things that are at least experienced as punishment in educational settings are done for reasons of conditioning.
Yes.
And not really, I'm not sure I would agree with the idea that it's irrational conditioning, but it can also be, adults are conditioned in law school, for example. They're still being conditioned and punished. And there's also punishment, sort of a pragmatic punishment for the sake of the performance of exams, and it's still experienced as a form of punishment, but the rationale is completely different. So how do we understand, I guess there are two questions. How do we understand punishment? And the second is, what is the relationship between educational punishment and educational settings?
Okay, thank you very much. Since I'm not really from the field of educational theory, I guess I cannot answer the second question. So that's unfortunate, but how to understand punishment? I started with a very rough definition, and it's in some literature you can find this definition. Okay, of course, there has to be some additional features about authority and so on. What I'm doing, I think it can be also applied to other contexts, and so there is also a conditioning for adults, of course. I would not only, perhaps I would not say conditioning, more like training. I'm not sure which word would be the best, but and this is not really pre-rational as well in the educational setting, because the children, by punishing them, I guess they would also be stimulated to start deliberating. If I forbid my son television because he didn't clean up his room, he has to think about it, and he has to deliberate. Should he clean up his room more often, then he will not get punished. So he learns how to, weigh reasons in a way. And so that's also a kind of training that will be stimulated by punishment, I guess. And I hope I at least have answered the first question, although the second, it's not my expertise.
Okay, in the interest of time, I guess we should go to these last two questions here. I don't see the volunteer here, and then we have one here, and then we should end there in order to leave enough time for him.
Good, thanks a lot. It's very enjoyable. I see three components in your paper, and I don't think they add up completely.
Okay.
It sounds like there's a theory of moral socialization, where there is a clear idea already of what the end point of that should be, namely a responsible individual. it sounds like there is a psychology of moral development, and when I hear it, it looks like you're looking for sort of psychological mechanisms to produce moral socialization. That's a quick way of putting it. And then you speak about what educators do. And they do something interesting by saying educators actually, they act in an anticipatory way. They don't respond to the facts, but they actually orient towards a future. And I think there's something interesting there. But then I think the other two components get in the way of taking that argument seriously. Because I would say the reference for the educator is not shame or guilt, but is the freedom of the child. And I'm just curious what would happen if you bring that more in, like saying the educational gesture is always Aufforderung zur Selbsttätigkeit. It's always to remind a child that they are a free being, even if all the facts go against it. And I think that's an educational dynamic that's very different from a socialization or psychological.
Okay.
But I just put it on the table. You don't need to respond.
Thank you very much. No, so your suggestion is that I should take into account more often the idea of freedom. So to match it with these thoughts about shame or guilt, or you suggesting that I should leave out this dimension of guilt and shame?
I would suggest that you should start with the educational angle.
Okay, I see.
There is a danger that when you go to shame and guilt, you do some kind of psychology.
Yes. Well, actually, the project that I'm pursuing is more like in moral psychology. So I use some considerations about moral education or upbringing to illustrate some concepts in moral philosophy and moral psychology. So maybe that's the reason why this appeared in this manner. And so I'm not sure if I will change my paper, but thank you for the suggestion.
We have the last question here. Okay.
Thank you so much. I really like the part about the as-if mode, and in fact, I do think that this is somehow could potentially lead us to this the reminder that children are free beings.
Yes.
And I just wanted to take this as-if mode to the question: what on your account counts as punishments? I'm thinking maybe you and your partner and your child are sitting on a table, and the child keeps interrupting your conversation, and then you could choose, you and your partner, for instance, to ignore the child. Would that on your account, because according to the as-if mode, it doesn't have to be a punishment because you are treating your child as a competent other.
Yes.
Where does that fall on your account?
That's the difficulty in this talk and the paper, because there is there's kind of a spectrum of negative reactions that you can exhibit towards the child, and punishment is just the extreme form on the outmost extreme. And so I think it does not need to be punishment. It could just be admonishment or a rebuke or something like this. But then I picked up on Müller, because he argues that there's still the necessity of punishing them, and I don't believe that this is really necessary. But I try to figure out if it really is necessary, or if we can just put in place some other perspectives. And so. But I think that this as-if mode, this proleptic engagement, is really important, and it's basically what we are doing in educating and raising our children. And I think it may be also the way to get into the picture freedom, because if we treat the children as responsible, then we are treating them as free beings. So maybe I should just put more emphasis on this part. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you everyone for the great discussion. Yes, yeah, always room for another round of applause. I'm sure you can ask other questions and continue the discussion during the coffee break. But now I am going to present our next presenter, Quynh from the Research Unit on Education, Culture and Society, Faculty of Psychology and Educational Sciences. Yeah, let's start the first slide. Okay, yes, so Research Unit on Education, Culture and Society, Catholic University of Leuven, with her presentation towards a decolonial account of raising children in Vietnam amid the parenting era.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here to share with you about my work in progress. So my whole project is actually, this is a part of my whole project, and the bigger one is about tracing the history of raising children in the last 30 years in Vietnam. And why the 30 years is because it's the starting point of globalization, and there's a lot of imports of ideas to Vietnam. So with the decolonial account here, I means that I want to trace a counter-narrative to the mainstream discourse of psychology, because maybe the parenting ideas are mostly familiar to you. Anyone's you have heard about parenting? Yeah. Okay, yeah, yeah, and so that is the very specific ideas from psychology, and I want to see if there's another alternative to look at the way that parents nowadays raise their children. Okay. Yeah, so this is the outline of my talk. Firstly, I will set the scene of parenting. The second part, I will introduce the show The Parent Has Changed. And thirdly, I will talk about the methods, and the last two bullet points are about the result of the research. So the results are more explorative, and it's still on the way. So I really hope that your questions can initiate more of my analysis. Yeah, so with the context of parenting, parenting is a very specific discourse of raising children rooted in the Western knowledge of developmental psychology and neurosciences. It is characterized by the expert figure because, so usually the parents are the authority figure in the house, and they have, let's say, the complete power, or parents and grandparents, but usually the parents are the one with the most power to decide how they will raise their children. But nowadays, parents are expected to follow expert advice on how to raise their children. So the authorities now are shifted toward the expert. And the problems with the parenting ideas of raising children is that it's tend to address the behavioral, emotional, and neuro issues of the child, and it's really put the emphasis on the child development. So it's as an overall statement, it reduced the act of raising children to a set of techniques, behavior, and skill. So, however, the act of raising children is much bigger, and it's about the Bildung as a German terms. So it's about what do we want to pass on to their children, and what do we select from our culture, our generation, to bring it to the children. And I hope that in the shows in the show, I can trace that account. So the parent has changed is documentary series, a TV documentary series in Vietnam, broadcasted in 2019 and 2020. It contains 5 episodes, and with approximately 60 minutes per episode. So as it is broadcasted from the national television, it has a whole spread around the country, and it's broadcasted 3 times per week. And at the same time, they also put it on YouTube channel with millions of views. So let's say they, like the television station, really want to promote the ideas of parenting toward the parents, not only like urbans, but also like rural parents, let's say. So it features 8 families with difficulties in raising children, and So the difficulty here are mostly coming from the parents themselves, because they, when they recruit the family for the shows, they tell the parents that, do you identify your own problems? So let's say it's not yet about not yet about the normative idea of what is right or what is wrong about raising children, but it's more about, firstly, parents who identify what is the issue in their own family. So, but the issue here is that most parents identify themselves with the perfectionist or commanding parents. It's not just about mother, but it's my fault to just put mothers here. Yeah, so I picked the very dramatic scenes from the shows that it's contained the punishment from, or like the very harsh pointing, and you need to do this, you need to do that, and children are expected to follow parents' wishes. And I think that's how parents say that they have issue with their children, because the children do not follow their words anymore. Yeah, so to me this is a case study because it is located within the 5 parameters. Firstly, it's the format of the show. So some of you might be familiar with the show Super Nanny from the UK, or like many other versions of it in the US, in Sweden, and Australia. Yeah, so this show is not a reality show, but it's a special documentary series. And to some extent, it's already a trace of counter-narrative, because with the documentary series, here it's addressed the problem from a curative stance instead of preventive. Yeah. The second one is the context. The context, like, it is set within the global discourse of change in education. And with the book of Furedi, he talks about change as a social trend now, because the past is not something we should rely on anymore, because past are old, is outdated, and for the we need to, like, education should be very much future oriented. And in Vietnam, this documentary series is actually one of like 1 in the 3 series, because the other 2 addresses the changes in principal, school principal, and teacher. The third one is the broadcasting location. So that's a national television broadcaster, VTV, like Vietnamese television. And it is interesting to me because that's a national television station belongs to the Communist Party. And it's really get neoliberalized lately, yeah, and promoting the Western ideas of education. Yeah. The third interesting parameter is the, like, let's say, the role of expert and parents versus the children. Because let's say the expert, they have certain power in the show, but it's not as powerful as the way that the nanny does. Because parents are invited to their classes and listen to the expert advice, but they do not come to the family house, because with the nanny shows, like the psychologists really intervene in the family space. But here, like, parents will try to apply what they listen from the expert and come back to the expert, and discuss with the expert about what they have done. And the voice of children are also very present in the show, because children navigate themselves as someone who also contribute to the family matters, and they are not just portrayed as someone like with behavioral issue, but they are portrayed with full incentive of what happened in the family. And the last one, yeah, the last one I already explained, actually, with the pedagogical space, and experts do not intervene there. Yeah, so I will come to the analysis part. So let's say the overarching theory that is portrayed in the show is the emotion coaching. Yeah, and this theory has been present since 1996, and it's rooted in positive psychology. Maybe I don't have time to go deeper into it, but let's say this theory is becoming more and more popular because it seems it is it is believed to bring the better child academic results, emotional knowledge, and peer relations. So let's say it's portrayed as a panacea in the in the shows in Vietnam as well. So I want to talk about the portrayal of emotion coaching in the show with 3 features. The first feature is a binary paradigm. The second one is a linearity, and the third one is concern for happiness as a life goal. With the binary paradigm, with the theory of emotion coaching, the parents are always like put in 2 oppositional positions, that either they do emotion coaching or they do emotion dismissing. So for example, when the parent do not show any attention to children emotion, they are immediately labeled as dismissing children emotion. And that is what exactly portrayed in the shows with like 2 professors from Korea. One say that we have a choice, like either to make our children our puppets, or we make them grow up to be mature adults. So the children future are like seem to be put in very like 2 extremes of the situation. With the linearity, I have a translation in the bottom part, but so let's say this is a slogan, and also like the quotations of that the editor quoted from the 2 advisors of the show. So the first one say that the childhood traumas can prevent children neurodevelopment and increase suicidal rates in the future. And it pops up in the show like very dramatic scene, because the parents, like when they are interviewed after, they said like they are very afraid of a scene that their children will commit suicide when they heard it from the expert. And this is like also aligned a bit with the concern for happiness after, but they say that in order to be successful, you need to be happy first. And the notion of success here is actually aligned with like it's portrayed as happiness, because like what they claim that there's no other success than being happy in life, something like that. Yeah, the linearity also portrayed in the 2 experts lecture. So with the first one, he said, Professor Pekcho said that when the adverse experience continue, then a lot of children will fall into games, and people with such behavioral problems cannot become successful in the future. Or when Professor Choi Sung-ae said that if we hit them, they will become, they don't know what will happen, they don't know how to slow down, and therefore when they become bigger, they will have more behavioral issues. So it's always like the causality is very direct from one things in the childhood to something very influential in the future. Yeah, and the third one, I really like these scenes because here we see the contrast, and which I will tell later about the counter narrative. But when the Professor Pekcho said that, do you think that you are doing the right thing to make sure that your children are very successful in the future and at the same time happy? And one of the mother in the studio say that maybe it's not yet about success or happiness. And the funny things about the Professor's Pekcho question is that he doesn't bother asking mother, what is your goal of raising children? But he said like, do you think you're doing the right thing to blah, blah, blah. And what comes after, it's already a norm in his mind about how raising children should direct to. And the portrayal, so that's the portrayal of emotion coaching. And now we move to the point of the portrayal of parents. And so parents are like, there's a lot of scene that parents confess that they are wrong. And the confession here is aligned with the governmentality and the technology of self that, like according to the theory of Foucault. So it's a very powerful tool that parents or like modern people use to discipline themselves. And here they even don't need any expert to tell them that they are wrong, but they already internalize the idea of parenting, and they committed under like in front of the camera that they are very wrong, and from now on they will change. Yeah, so Mother Hương said that I see myself, but yeah, I see myself as a very normal parent before attending the show, but then now I understand that I'm abnormal. So we see a very big shift in what is the right thing to do to their children. Yeah, Mother Ha also shared the same idea that my child becoming the person she is today is due to me. So the confessions and the guilt there is very strong. At the beginning and the end of every show, the editor keeps saying that those parents are very courageous parents because they dare to confess they are wrong, and then they are committed to change. Yeah. Yeah, so I will come to the final part, and I really want to develop it richer in the future. So here we see the confrontation. Yeah, we see the confrontation of the concern for happiness and the existential concern, because like in most of the episode, mothers wrote, like, because at the end of each show they need to write a diary, and they wrote in the diaries that everything they do for a child now, for their children now, is to make sure that the children can be independent in the future. What if they pass away? So what else can the children do? So it's more about the survival and the being able to cope with the difficulty of life rather than being happy. And it's very much aligned with the history of Vietnam, because we have a long history of war and then the economic turbulence. So that's why the concern there is more about how to survive the daily life and not like being happy. Yeah. I don't mean that being happy is not good. I mean that yeah. Yeah. And the second counter narrative here is the change for behavioral issues and the change versus the change for others. Because in the nanny shows, most of the time, parents stand in the show with the problems like how to discipline my child because they don't listen to me anymore. But in the show, parent has changed. The motivation to change actually comes from everyone in the family, because they want to build a harmony in the family, and whenever they do something, they really want to bring the benefits to the other people in the family. Yeah. Actually, the first quote is from the Mother Chang, but she also quoted her children, because after the child noticing that she has made a huge change, she said that I want you to change so as to rescue me, to rescue the family and the whole world. So and that child is also the one who really encouraged the mother to join the show. Yeah, so there's a certain counter ideas here with the counter logic of the parent attending the show. Yeah, and that is the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Quynh, so much for a very interesting presentation. I'm sure you're gonna get a lot of questions and comments. Okay, over there.
Because it's fresh then. I looked at the title of your talk again because it's toward a decolonial account of raising children in Vietnam. And what I heard from your talk was a kind of criticism of the Americanization of parenting in Vietnam. Is that correct? I mean, you're identifying the way in which mass media in Vietnam, supported by the communist state, is supporting narratives about positive psychology, about self-realization, about the need for parenting to produce, I don't even know what how you measure happiness or how, but I mean, is this not correct? So I'm curious, what to you, what would be a different way of raising children in Vietnam that would be decolonial? Yeah.
Let's say the background of my presentation comes from the pedagogical understanding of education, because we care, as a pedagogue, we care about what can we bring and how to socialize the child into that culture. Yeah, so let's say what I want to explore in my research, besides the behaviorals and emotional coach, I want to see what is at stake there that makes a Vietnamese child, make a child in Vietnam a Vietnamese person. So, yeah, and that I don't mean that I'm falling into the nationalist idea of being a Vietnamese or anything, but let's say, what does it mean to be a child in that? What does it mean to raise a child in that particular context? Am I answering your question? So it's getting a bit further than criticisms. But here, with what I'm having today, it's more like the criticism part. But what I want to develop later is about what does it mean to raise a child in Vietnam. Yeah.
You have a question? Okay.
Thank you. Very interesting. And I wonder, I come to think about this consulting special pedagogues we have in Sweden who never meets the kids, just give advice to the teachers. And what do you think is the problem with these experts who doesn't engage, and how do they affect the lingo of the parents?
So what is your question, like how?
Can you see in the series how those experts influences the parents without being in the context, and how, do you see some problems in that, and how?
Like how does the expert advice influence the parents?
How do you see a change in their in their
mindset? Yeah, I don't talk to every parent who watch your shows, because that's what my ambitions. Yeah, but
I met a parent in the show.
Yeah, the parent. So yes, yeah, yes, but not for everyone. Not for everyone, because for some they receive a lot of elaboration from their children, and somehow it makes it easier for those parents to adapt to the theory of emotion coaching. But for some parents, they still, like, their difficulties or their old way of raising children is still there, still very present, because the belief is that the belief of those parents is that if they create an adverse environment at home, the children will get used to that environment, and later on, if they encounter something difficult, they will have the same strength and resilience. Yeah, so that's their logic. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Quynh, for this presentation. I was intrigued by your opening observation that there is this shift that you describe in parenting going on, kind of a way, like it used to be that parents have the authority, and now the authority is shifted towards experts. And it made me think that that's, I mean, in my private observation, that's true in many places over the world. Or I mean, the friends I have that are parents in South Africa, in the States, and in Switzerland, they all now read these how-to books.
Yeah.
And I was curious if you can give us any examples for books that are like have a like kind of Western brand. I was thinking of, maybe you know this Tiger Mom that made a splash, and I mean, I think it was written by a French woman. Like, what kind of literature, or I mean, you showed us a documentary today, but maybe there is something like global about this phenomenon that you're describing, and I'm trying to see if there's something that just also made it to Vietnam that I might know.
But you talk about the Tiger Mom, and Tiger Mom is more in the Asian culture rather than a global feature, I think. It's a global figure.
Right, I just know that the people in Europe, that I know, that our parents, they all are raving about Tiger Mom, and which is kind of a weird, import of Asian culture of, and I think it's practiced in France now, or it was, it became popular in France especially. But yeah, maybe that's an interesting example for.
You said about the idea of tiger mom is becoming more popular in France. That I don't know, but actually, I got a colleague. She's her kids' school is a very international school, and she told me that it's a dilemma. But she's really asked the teacher to place her kid with the Asian kids, because she doesn't. She liked the idea of tiger mom in the sense that they care about their child academic performance. So that is an example addressing to what you say. And the second aspect of, like, you're curious about how tiger moms is portrayed in the
Are there any other popular how-to books about how to parent that we could give that are very popular in Vietnam that might be internationally known?
I think we are not there yet. I think in China probably, because I read an anthropological book about about parenting in China, and they very much concerned, like they are fascinated by the Americanized idea of raising children as well, but at the same time they put a question but how about the child academic performance? Because if I put my child into American school, then they study everything, but they couldn't cope with the standardized test in China. Because the standardized testing in China is very competitive, and to some extent it's still not to some extent, but like it's still the prominent way to have the mobility to climb up the mobility ladder.
Okay.
One question.
So we have one more question in the back, and then we have to cut for coffee break and for
yes.
Thanks, Quynh. I enjoy that presentation, especially when when the parent gave the child the responsibility to rescue the world. You mentioned parents learning techniques, behaviors, and skills to raise their children. Can you be a bit more specific about these techniques, skills, and behaviors that are so different from traditional means? And you also talked about the importance of socialization and resilience. And I just wanted to know, what role does culture play in this new framework of upbringing? I know you talked about creating the adverse environment at home, but are there any more aspects of culture that might have been embedded in this sort of new framework?
The new framework that you mean the one that I'm trying to come up with, or
no, the new things that they're doing now, the new methods that they're applying.
Okay.
The parents are applying.
So with the first questions about what is the elaboration of the technique. So with the emotion coaching, for example, they have 5 techniques. They have 5 steps in the technique. Like first, identify or addressing your child emotion. The second thing is to take it as an opportunity to connect with your child. A third one is direct your child into a solution that satisfies both you and them. So I don't remember exactly those 5 steps, but that is how it's go. And with your second question is I forgot it. I'm sorry. Actually, if talking about parenting itself, there's not much elements of cultures there, because the culture is a scientific culture. They try to apply the latest expertise in the field of developmental psychology and neurosciences to boost up the child neural development. And they have the certain milestone that children need to achieve by a certain age. So what I'm looking for is actually the cultural part of it, and Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. I want to thank our presenters